much for being here. My name is Cari Clark, and along with Sharon Watkins, who owns Chez Zee, we formed this series in 2016 to bring authors to a fun and relaxed setting where you can sit down and have a glass of wine. I'm also a realtor at Sotheby's International, and it is my pleasure to bring my good friend Annette McGivney to the Authors Series. We've been talking about this for about a year. Annette and I met in college at University of Texas in the 80s, and Annette was an honors Plan 2 major, very earnest student. She lived in Austin for many years. She has a master's in fine arts. She's also an award-winning journalist. Currently, she's the Southwest editor for Backpacker magazine. She's also the principal lecturer in journalism at Northern Arizona University. She lives in Flagstaff, Arizona, and has a son in college right now. This is her 5th book. All of them have been nonfiction books, works of. And I wanted to say thank you to all. She has family here who's come from Dallas. She has friends that have come up from Conroe. I have a bunch of women who I work with, many members of my book club, and Pam LeBlanc is here, who did a wonderful blurb for Annette last week on her blog. And I just want to say thank you all so much for coming out to support Annette. Writers need audiences, and so you being here means a lot. And today what we're talking about is Annette's incredible book called Pure Land. And Annette, why don't you begin to give us a summary? Because it's a complicated book with a lot of characters and a lot going on. We won't be able to cover all of it, but we're going to hit the highlights.
Okay, and I guess you guys can hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, so it's a hard book to summarize, but it is part true crime and part memoir. The true crime part it's an investigation into the most brutal murder in the history of Grand Canyon. A woman named Tamami a Japanese hiker, was murdered in Grand Canyon on the Havasupai Reservation. When she was hiking to Havasu Falls, she was murdered by an 18-year-old Havasupai tribal member named Randy Kagame. And I started this book when I wrote a story for Backpacker investigating the circumstances behind that murder. The memoir part happens to be the fact that the more I investigated the murder, the more I was pulled into the story personally, at first not knowing it. And so it's also partly about how family violence is passed down through generations, not only in Randy's family, but my own. And so I also investigate, in addition to the murder, I investigate trauma and PTSD and ultimately connections to nature and how connections to nature can heal wounds like trauma and other emotional wounds. So anyway, that's what it's about.
Okay, so we got 3 main characters, so we're going to explore them a little bit. Let's go ahead and start with Randy. You know, and this is in a classic Annette McGivney, and I've known that a long time. So Annette, decides to dig into this story. So she has to, you can't just get to the reservation. You have to hike all the way down to the reservation. Or you can take a $900 helicopter ride. So Annette hikes down there to investigate, not once, but multiple times. And not only that, she visits Randy in prison. So tell us a little bit about Randy.
Randy was, and initially when I was writing this story for Backpacker, a lot of information was withheld because they thought the case was going to go to trial. And so law enforcement was keeping a lot of his information about his youth private until the case went to trial. So it took me a while to find out all this. But Randy was descended from one of the longtime families, indigenous families of the Grand Canyon in the Havasupai tribe. Kagame, his last name is actually the name of a layer in the Supai Formation in the Grand Canyon. So a geologic layer is named Kagame after the family. Randy's ancestors farmed for hundreds, if not thousands of years in the Grand Canyon. Randy himself, like a lot of tribal members were involved in drugs and alcohol problems on the reservation, and he had a history of offenses in the juvenile correctional system. So when I encountered him after he'd committed this murder, he had a pretty long rap sheet for being 18.
So when you first, and you have hiked Grand Canyon many times, but you had never been to the reservation before. Tell us what it was like when you got there.
Right. Well, I know there's some people here that I had a chance to talk with when they were coming in who have hiked in Grand Canyon National Park. And like all of our national parks, we're very fortunate in this country, have such amazing crown jewels that are pretty well maintained with infrastructure, hotels at the top, developed trails, law enforcement, all the kind of things that we expect here in the United States. The Havasupai Reservation, like most reservations in the west, of the American West, does not have that same type of infrastructure. So this destination, Havasu Falls, where the victim hiked to, is very well known because it's so beautiful. It's like these spectacular waterfalls, but on the reservation, they don't have the same type of infrastructure as the national park, so it's pretty haphazard. The campground is not well maintained. The bathrooms are not always functioning, all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of a rough area. It has a history of animal abuse. There's like horses that are malnourished and not treated well, dogs, stray dogs, and so it's kind of a rough area to witness in terms of the poverty and just the stress of the people and the animals. But this landscape is beautiful, but so it's a complicated place to visit because you're there to connect with the landscape, but it's hard to also not notice that there's a whole community of people there that are under stress.
And so you hike to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and Annette has to pretend like she's a tourist because there's a gag order. So tell us a little bit about your first time down there.
Okay, so it was always just kind of a roll of the dice when I took on the story for Backpacker. It was my idea to write the story, and part of the complication was that the Havasupai tribe, after the murder happened, didn't want any press about it because it's bad for tourism, to say that someone was stabbed 29 times. And so they wanted to put the, lid on any press about the murder. And so they had banned the media from Havasu Falls, from visiting the reservation. So I went there as a tourist just to see what might happen if I could possibly get any information, and even if the story would be possible. So the first time I hiked down there for this story, which was my first time to visit Supai, I'd avoided Supai as an editor for Backpacker magazine because I felt like it was a really complicated place to visit for someone who loves the landscape, to also witness some of the other things going on. So the first time I ever went to Supai was for this story, and I got down there and I just decided to just sit down there for a while and see what happened, if it seemed like I might be able to do a story at all. And so I sat in the middle of town for about 5 hours and just watched people go by, and this guy, a tribal member, came up to me. He was selling books, and I'm sure he came up to a lot of people, just a lot of tourists. He was selling books, and he struck up a conversation with me, and I decided to go ahead and tell him that I was a journalist and I was working on a story, and I wasn't sure if that would cause me to be told to hike out. They've definitely told people that weren't welcome there to hike out, and so I wasn't sure if that was going to be the case, but he was actually glad that I was there to do a story, because a lot of the tribal members weren't happy with the tribal council, who decided that they wanted no media coverage, where some of the tribal members thought we need to talk about the problems. The world needs to know what we're going through down here. And so he started talking to me, and that one thing led to another, as far as he connected me to other tribal members, and I was able to do interviews. But in order to avoid the tribal council knowing that I was doing a story, I had to sneak around. And so I had to hide my recorder and my notebook, and I had to take like secret paths around the village so they didn't notice I was going to private homes, because tourists don't go to homes in the village. They just go right through to the falls. And so it was kind of a sneaky, covert operation.
So, Annette is a dogged reporter, she can already figure out. And so she ended up getting, the family gave her the 10-inch file of Randy's juvenile delinquency and court, child custody cases. And they trusted her to get the story right. And then, in the middle of the story, and we're just going to stay on Randy for a little bit longer, you read all these files about this kid who has been shuttled around, and his father was taken off the reservation. Tell us a little bit about Randy's father and what happened to him when he was taken off the reservation, and why he was taken off the reservation.
Okay, yeah, so some of this I discovered later after this backpacker story was published, once I had more access and I was working on the book. But Randy's father, Randy, was the great-great-grandson of a man named Billy Burrow. And for people that have hiked in Grand Canyon, you may have, like, the Bright Angel Trail is known to you, and about halfway down the Bright Angel Trail there's a place called Indian Garden, which is a very well-known. So Billy Burrow was the Indian at Indian Garden. He lived there. He's farmed there in the summer and grew food. Like all Havasupai tribal members, he grew food in the summer around the springs in Grand Canyon and hunted on the plateau in the winter. So none of the tribal members lived in near Havasu Falls or anywhere along the creeks and springs in Grand Canyon except in the summer. And so Billy Burrow, along with all the Havasupai tribal members, was expected to leave the Grand Canyon, the Havasupai tribe. Their native homeland was all of Grand Canyon, which is about 2 million acres, plus about 1 million acres of plateau above Grand Canyon on the south rim. So that's 3 million acres that was their indigenous home for thousands of years. In the late 1800s, like all Native American tribes, they were expected to be forced onto a reservation. They were put on a reservation that was 500 acres. And so they were compressed into this little area along Havasu Creek, where Havasu Falls is, and expected to survive there. And they weren't a community of farmers, they were a community of hunters. So they didn't even know how to farm, except for minimal amount of crops in the summer. But anyway, so that was a huge stress. And Billy Burrow, Randy's great-great-grandfather, had always lived at this place called Indian Garden, and he was one of the few Havasupai tribal members that they were living all throughout Grand Canyon, what is today Grand Canyon National Park. It was once the home of lots of families, and they would be located at all the different springs in the canyon. And Billy Burrow lived in this one place. It happened to be along the Bright Angel Trail, and you may have seen this picture. Teddy Roosevelt, when Grand Canyon National Park was created, with great fanfare, rode his mule down Bright Angel Trail and personally evicted Billy Burrow from his home at Indian Garden because it was an eyesore for the tourists, and they wanted to kick out the Native Americans because they felt their straw wickiup kind of shelters were an eyesore and would be bad for business for the Fred Harvey company that was running tours, mule rides down into the Grand Canyon. So Billy Burrow was evicted. They tore his home down. He was forced onto the reservation. He died a year later. Descended from that, Randy's father, Billy West Kagame, at the age of, and I found this through Child Protective Services records that were given to me, at the age of 4, Billy was abandoned by his parents down in the village of Supai and was, this is according to their records, was found tied to a tree along the creek. And so his parents had abandoned him, and he was just being taken care of by someone, and they didn't want him to wander off, so they tied him to this tree. And so Child Protective Services removed Billy from the reservation, and you may be familiar with this. In addition to boarding school for Native Americans in the 1950s and 1960s, there was also forced adoption. And so he was adopted into foster families in Phoenix that were becoming adoptive parents because they were paid a stipend by the state government. So this family that he was adopted in already had something like 10 or 11 Native American children that they had in the home, and all the children were forbid to speak their native language. They were put into public schools in Phoenix and were punished, you know, for doing anything according to the customs that they knew from their tribe. And so ultimately, Billy, by the time he was in high school, he dropped out of high school and he moved back to the reservation. And so he had a lot of issues, as you can imagine, and some of those issues were passed on to his son.
Okay, so that gives you, so that's the murderer and his family and a little bit of the background. So let's move on to the victim, so tell us about Tamami.
Tamami, when I was first investigating this for Backpacker, I didn't know anything about her. The only information I had about her was from the autopsy that the coroner had done. So I had the autopsy report. I knew what she was wearing. I knew she hiked to Havasupai Falls on her birthday. I knew she visited Grand Canyon Park a couple of prior times, but I would later come to learn so much more. And from the first time I saw the story in the daily newspaper in Flagstaff that this woman had been murdered, I felt this connection to her, and I felt like she had become famous for people that followed the Grand Canyon for her death. And I felt like, what about her life? Like, what is her life? What drew her down there? What was she looking for? And what kind of person was she? And so over a period of years, I got to learn more about her. She grew up in a family where she was raised by her father. At the age of 4, her mother abandoned the family. So her father was from a very rural Japanese home. He had no education, so he worked, and there's no labor unions in Japan, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, so he worked 12-hour shifts at a factory. And so Tamami didn't have any siblings, so she was basically raised herself. So she definitely experienced quite a bit of neglect growing up, but when she was there, her family and friends said, living alone, she collected magazines and photos of landscapes, big, wild landscapes in the American West, like Grand Canyon and Yosemite and the Badlands and Monument Valley, and she would tape these pictures on her wall in her bedroom in Japan, in Yokohama, which is a suburb of Tokyo. It's really densely populated. She lived there with her father, and she was really drawn to these places, and she decided that she wanted to, after graduating from high school, instead of getting married, becoming a professional in Japan, she just really wanted to learn English and travel to the United States and explore these landscapes. And so she was the kind of person that she decided, I want to do this, and then she would figure out how. And since she was so poor, she knew she needed to learn English, but the only place she could afford to learn English was in an English as a second language program and she didn't want to take English in Japan. She wanted to come to the United States. So she could afford the program at the University of Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. So not only had she never left Japan, her father had never left Japan, all of a sudden she's going from Yokohama, this suburban, densely populated area in Japan, to Hattiesburg, Mississippi. She called it the land of hamburgers. And she was just infatuated with everything American. She wanted to just immerse herself in American culture, and especially the landscapes, that were like beautiful, like our iconic landscapes here in the United States in the West, and also Native American culture. She felt like getting to know the land was also part of that experience was also getting to know the indigenous people of the landscapes. And so she was really interested in learning more about Native American culture, and she just lived for the next trip to the United States. She worked in low-level factory jobs like her father and just would earn as much money as she could, and then she would come here and do a trip, and then once her money was out, she'd go back to Japan and work 12-hour days until she had enough money, and then she would do it all over again.
And she traveled all over the West. She went to Yellowstone, Monument Valley. She lived in a Navajo, what do you call it? Hogan for months and learned and wove a basket in the middle of winter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She's been an inspiration for me to get out and go places, honestly. And in Annette's research, she even went all the way to Japan. So tell us a little bit about meeting Tamami's parents and what happened there.
Okay, so after the backpacker story was published, and I just felt normally, and I'm sure Pam feels this way, when you're done with a story, you're just like, okay, that's over with, on to the next thing. It's kind of like, don't look back. But I was just, this stuck with me. After I was done with the backpacker assignment, there was so much more I wanted to know. And I especially didn't want Tamami's memory to just be about this, and other people would say, this woman, she hiked alone in Grand Canyon. That's what happens when you're a woman and you hike alone in Grand Canyon. And I thought, well, I hike alone in Grand Canyon, and that's like, there's more to this than that. And so I wanted to know so much more about her. And so I started just by writing letters to the Japanese consulate in Los Angeles, and they would write back saying, her father is not interested in talking to the media, and especially not to the media in the United States. He had never left Japan until he had to come to the United States to retrieve his daughter's body. And so he was not interested in Americans at all. And but I kept writing letters, and I guess somehow those letters maybe were getting to him. And ultimately, law enforcement detectives with the FBI that I had become friends with said there's this memorial service that's happening in Phoenix, and the father's actually coming from Japan. It was a victim's memorial service. He's coming, you can come to this service with us, and maybe you can connect with him. And so I wrote this letter and gave it to the Japanese language interpreter that was working for the FBI, and then she gave it, after the memorial service, she gave it to Tamami's father, and he read it, and he conferred with his other family members, and they decided that his sister, Tamami's aunt, felt like Tamami wanted me to come to Japan. And this was the aunt's interpretation. So the aunt told her brother, she needs to come because Tamami wants her to come. And so they wrote back to the interpreter, and they didn't say just, okay, I guess you can come. They said, please come, please. And so they invited me, and all of a sudden, I didn't ever think it was really going to happen. And all of a sudden, I had this opportunity to go to Japan. I didn't have a contract for a book. I didn't speak Japanese. There were so many barriers to pulling this off, but it just seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. And not doing it was just not an option for me. And so fortunately, the Japanese language interpreter agreed to go with me. I was a single parent, and so my son was 11 at the time, and I couldn't leave him behind, so he came with me. And so basically, I drained my savings, everything I had, to finance a 3-week trip to Japan. And so we went to Japan, and the family just rolled out the red carpet for us. They wanted, it was their chance to honor their daughter and their niece and their friend. And so Tamami's father, Tetsushi, invited day after day. We spent time in Yokohama, and then we drove down to southern Japan where the Hanamura ancestral home is, in Tamami's grave. And the Hanamura family, I interviewed all of them. Mr. Hanamura had Tamami's good friends come over, and I visited with them. And then we went down to the ancestral home. I visited Tamami's grave. Mr. Hanamura also gave me things that Tamami had kept from her trips. She had all these photo albums. She kept diaries, and because her father didn't like her visiting the United States, and she knew English, she wrote all her diaries in English. And so he gave me her diaries. He said, "Here, I can't do anything with this." He said, "Use this to tell my daughter's story." And so he gave those to me, and it was just incredible. And I, before this has all came about, I never imagined in a million years I'd be going to Japan. I mean, I just am not an international traveler, but to learn about Japanese culture and to just be absorbed, not as a tourist, but I was treated as family with them, and my son and the interpreter. It was an incredible experience to be able to experience Japanese culture on this intimate level.
So Annette comes back from Japan. She's got photo albums and diaries and letters, and so she's hard at work on a book. She's working very hard on a book. And she gets, Randy at this point is now confessed. You can read about how the confession came about. And Annette is working on the scene about the murder, and Annette starts having nightmares. And why don't you tell us about what happens with that?
Okay.
When you start having your nightmares.
Okay. Yeah, so in the beginning, this book was just going to be about Tamami and Randy and the story of their lives. After there was no chance of a trial, the FBI gave me all their investigation files, including audio with Randy, like when the detectives were down in Supai talking to him down there, and also when he confessed. And so there was a 3-hour interview done that I listened to where he described what happened. And I had also gotten more information about his childhood and how he was beaten, by his parents, by his both mother and father, beaten so badly that he had scars. His mother shot him in the leg. It was a really brutal, violent childhood that he experienced. So that started getting to me, and also the confession itself, just the description of the murder, and of course, since it was a law enforcement investigation, they went over in great detail with him exactly how the stabbings happened, over what time, everything about it, and it really started to get to me, and I started not being able to sleep. I started having nightmares, and the nightmares caused me to not want to sleep. And so I thought, well, I'm getting too anxious, this murder is getting to me. So I took up meditation. So I started trying to meditate during the day, and when I would kind of slip into that meditative state, the same thing would happen, which was someone was kind of approaching me and about to attack me, and it was the most horrible feeling, like I was about to die. And so ultimately it was just sort of this decline over a period of weeks, where I started, not only did I have this, but there was so much adrenaline running through me that I was like shaking, trembling. So I ended up going for 10 days without sleeping, which is, I know it's hard to believe, but so it was just this kind of hell. And I just thought, I'm having a nervous breakdown, like what is happening to me? And all I could think was like this murder, somehow this murder is like I'm just reliving this murder. So I went to the doctor and I was just a mess, and she said, you've got to go to a psychiatrist, I can't help you. And she said, not only that, you have to go to an emergency psychiatrist, like right now.
Oh.
So I ended up in the psychiatrist's office, and the psychiatrist, I was going to say, you know, all this stuff that was going on with this murder investigation and circumstances around my life that I thought were causing me to be this way, but I was so desperate. One of the first things the psychiatrist asked me was about my own childhood, and I did experience some pretty intense violence growing up for many years, and I kept those memories repressed. And the minute he asked me about it, it just exploded out of me, and to all of a sudden I was actually admitting what had happened. And my whole adult life I had worked very hard to not acknowledge it, because I thought if I didn't acknowledge it, it would never bother me. But what I was doing was, the more I investigated the murder, the more I was reminding myself about what had happened to me, and in some ways like trying to figure out what had happened to me. And so all of a sudden I was diagnosed with chronic delayed onset PTSD. And so the book, like the story about Randy and Tamami, was kind of put aside as I had flashbacks, you know, like just like veterans that come home with PTSD. I had all those types of symptoms. So it was pretty much, it was an emotional health crisis.
And your psychiatrist or psychologist said that you had dissociative amnesia, which was a shock to you. So tell us a little bit about that and the repetition compulsion. And
Okay.
so then,
So, and part of, the psychiatrist helped me, but also the minute I was given this diagnosis and I realized this was going on, I mean, the only way I know how to like kind of process things is as an investigative journalist. And I was like, all right, I need to investigate this. So I immediately started doing a lot of research myself about it. So some of this, like the mental health professionals definitely helped me with this, but I also did a lot of research on my own. And dissociative amnesia is especially common among, and I think we do have some mental health workers here, but dissociative amnesia is very common among children who experience events in a situation, you know, like where parents are being crazy, you know, where there's violence, if they're being attacked, or even like alcoholic parents that, you know, are maybe abusing their mother or partner. A child, unless there's someone that goes to the child and says, you know, this is really crazy, come here, let me comfort you. If a child is just left there to like witness things and not have any help in how to process them, if everyone else in the house is pretending like it didn't happen, then the child will also be like, okay, you know, I guess I'll just pretend like that didn't happen. And so that can really build over a period of years and become a behavior pattern where you shove these things into your subconscious, where you sort of pretend like they never happened, and can sort of sleepwalk through life thinking, you know, this didn't happen, but there's a part of your mind that does know that it happened, and that's the amnesia part. And so, you know, those things can definitely come back, and the repetition compulsion is related to that. That's Freud came up with that term originally when he was doing his own research, especially about, at the time, women that had been abused in their lives. The repetition compulsion is where you have repressed memories, especially from childhood, and there's a part of you that wants to resolve those incidents, like whatever happened, you know, that you witnessed and you weren't able to work through it at the time. There's a part of you that wants to get back to that situation so that you can resolve it maybe to figure out what happened, or to make it stop, even though it's in the past. And so those that type of behavior, you keep putting yourself into a similar situation so that you can subconsciously figure it out. And so I was seeking out that murder and learning more about the murder because I was actually trying to get closer to my own relationship with violence and family violence in particular, and family violence caused by my father especially.
So Annette put the book aside and spent years trying to recover her sanity. And she did absolutely everything anybody could do, everything from body-based therapy. She went to adult child of alcoholics. She went to therapy. She did an incredible amount of research, which is detailed in her book. She did research on the trauma bond. Tell us a little bit about the trauma bond, and then, it all ties together because Randy was a descendant of a long shame and humiliation and violence. So tell us about the trauma bond and just the way it ties together with Tamami and Randy.
So the trauma bond is similar. I'm sure you guys have heard of the Stockholm Syndrome. So it's similar to that in terms of, especially with a child and an abusive parent, or in a marriage or a partnership where there's abuse of one partner, and instead of normally you would be like, this person is hurting me, I'm going to get away. There's a bond that's formed, and it's a power dynamic where, especially the person that's in the vulnerable situation, the child or the partner in the domestic violence, they are seeking the person who's doing the abuse wields control over the child, and there's this behavior where the person who's the abuser will be very kind and loving to the victim sometimes, and then all of a sudden they'll flip and then they'll be abusive. And so it creates this dynamic where the victim is often trying to seek out the positive side of that person and ignoring the negative side. And Randy was definitely had that type of bond with his father. His father said that Randy was his favorite son, and that Randy also said how much he loved his father, even though his father was very abusive to Randy. And I had, in my view, a similar relationship with my father where I felt like, I was his little girl, I looked like him, I had a lot of his same traits, and I always wanted to make him proud, but I was also the one that received the most abuse in terms of violence from him.
All right, I've got one more question. In Annette's research, she came across this, and I didn't really know much about it, historical trauma. And you think basically that the whole tribe is suffering from historical trauma. So talk about that, and then I'm going to open it up to, I could go on and on and on, I have pages of things. I want to talk about one more thing, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, so historical trauma is, obviously trauma affects the individual, but it can also affect entire cultures. In entire groups of people. Certainly we've seen that with Holocaust victims. And not only does it affect that group in their lifetimes, but according to my research, it can be passed on to the next generation, not only through behavior traits, where maybe there's unhealthy behaviors that are passed on to the next generation, but also genetically. I mean, there's research about epigenetics that shows that people whether it's Native American cultures or Holocaust survivors, that their DNA is actually impacted by the trauma that they experience, and that their descendants can have some of those traits. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be acting out, and if those behavior traits are going to be manifested, but they have the potential, a much higher potential than other people who have not descended from trauma to respond in certain ways. So the trauma can definitely makes people more easily hyper arousal, where like if you are the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, normal day-to-day stress, like you have a really rough day at work, can make you way more anxious than someone who's not the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor. And that's not just a learned thing, it could also be inherited, like in your genetic makeup. And there's some studies that say that's not true, but in my research I found there's more studies that say that it is true. And so with Native Americans, certainly we know that they experience genocide. And so Native American tribes have a huge problem with historical trauma. And in some ways you could say that that could be a large contributing factor for substance abuse. Because when you have all those repressed memories and trauma symptoms, a lot of people need to numb out through drugs and alcohol because they don't know any other way to deal with it. And so historical trauma is something that is, it's a real problem for Native Americans and other populations. In the book, it's not just Native Americans. In the book, I did a little bit of research in my own ancestry and this is, I don't know for a fact, but it's possible that because I was descended from Irish Americans, Irish Catholics, and my great-grandparents were in the potato famine in Ireland, and experienced a lot of trauma and came to the United States and were persecuted where they lived in Louisiana. Irish Americans at that time were considered the lowest rung on the ladder. That maybe some of that was passed on, and maybe some of that could help explain my father's behavior.
That's a lot. So I'm going to open it up. One thing I do want you to know is that Tamami was with Annette while she wrote this book. It tears me up every time, but her spirit was with you the whole time. And it shows in your research and your courage to face your abuse. And it was an amazing thing that it came together. And it didn't just happen. So I'm going to pass the mic. And does anyone, Robin, would you mind passing the mic around? For anybody, does anybody have a question? Sorry, I promised myself I wasn't going to cry. But. So Pam's got a question and Mary Dickerson.
Annette, I know you're a journalist, and so when you went into the story, you probably went into it thinking that you were going to be unbiased about Randy's story and Tamami's story. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you found yourself sympathizing with one side or the other as you investigated it further. And I'm also curious about Randy and where he is now.
Okay, so I definitely tried to be unbiased. And I actually tried to be unbiased all the way through, even after I had my own PTSD breakdown. I was putting myself in the story. I tried to, everything that I put in the story, I made sure that it was based on some factual documentation. Like even my own childhood, I found information from my journals, and it's, some things were corroborated by my older sister who's here. And so I always felt like it was hard to trust my memory alone, and I didn't want this to go down that road of being fabricated in any way, just for my own self. Like being accurate is really important. And so I guess in the beginning I kind of took the traditional view of really just trying to honor Tamami. Like she was the victim, and Randy was like this kid that had done something incredibly horrible. And so I wanted to learn more about him, but I guess I was really kind of Tamami's champion. But the more I found out about Randy, the more I became sympathetic to him. Like when I visited him in jail, man, my heart melted. Like he was he was like, seemed like a good kid to me, you know, like and so I became sympathetic to him, and I also got a sense of, like, I mean, there's something like Cari brought up with Tamami. I felt like there was definitely, you know, it wasn't just me. I felt like Tamami's spirit in some ways was guiding me, and I felt like part of my mission was this, to not only show compassion for Tamami, but to show compassion, if not for Randy, and specifically for his culture and for his plight. And so ultimately, I feel like I was equally invested in both of them. I was definitely equally invested in trying to be as fair and compassionate to Randy as possible, and to not. I definitely like turned down some deals with publishers who wanted me to play up the sensational crime aspects of Randy and make him more of a villain. And they didn't like that I made people feel maybe some compassion for him, if that's what they got out of the story. So ultimately I tried to make it a really balanced, you know, there's no judgment about what he did. I didn't want it to be that way. And then what was the second part of the question?
I was just wondering where Randy is now.
Oh, so yeah, so Randy now, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Tamami's father did not want him to have the death penalty. And so he was sentenced, he'll never have parole. He's in a federal prison in Colorado.
How old is he, and has he read the book?
He has not read the book as far as I know. I'm working on how to get I would actually like to go to Colorado and take the book to him. I wrote him several times when I was working on the book, and he didn't get back to me. So I don't know if I'm actually going to try and talk to the warden at the prison and see if the warden would allow me to go there, because I feel like I don't want it to just arrive in the mail. Like I want it to, I mean, he knows I wrote the book, or was writing the book, because I wrote letters to him about it. So I don't know how he'll respond.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about your relationship with Diana,
Mm-hmm.
who ultimately got him to confess, because you lost track of her and you had to track her down, and it appears that the murder really took a toll on her.
It did,
Well,
right.
So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so Diana Fowles was a counselor at the Coconino County Jail when Randy was there during the investigation before he was charged. And pretty much all the law enforcement people that worked this case were traumatized, if not specifically by this case, by sort of the profession in general and the violence they had dealt with. And so Diana was so impacted by what she experienced working on this case and working with Randy that she had PTSD, and after Randy was sentenced, she quit her job and she moved. And no one, I was trying to interview her, and I kept asking everyone I could find, like, do you know where Diana is? I want to interview her. And they're like, we don't know. And so I would like search on Facebook, and one day, like, I found who I thought was her on Facebook, and I sent her a message. And I sent her repeated messages, and she didn't get back to me. And I thought, well, if it is her, maybe she just doesn't want to talk about it, and I can understand that. And 3 years later, she responded. And this book took 10 years, so it was like a lot of things. It didn't happen just like that. It was like, you know, people didn't get back to me for years, and then the story would change because of that. And so after a couple of years, Diana got back to me, and she was finally ready to talk about it. And this, she wasn't, and there were like multiple instances like this. Not only was she ready to talk about it, but she had this envelope of notes that Randy had written to her and drawings, and she'd been holding on to it, and she just had decided that she was ready to pass the torch, and she wanted me to have the envelope. And so when I met with her, just like the diaries from Tamami's father that he handed to me, we met, and she said, I want you to have these, I'm ready, you tell the story. And she and I have become friends since then. And this book is, I don't know where the
Barb,
photo
will you bring the photo, Barb?
of the law enforcement.
Yeah.
So this book it's not only for Tamami's father, to honor his daughter, but also this is the law enforcement team that worked on the case. And they came to my book party a couple weeks ago in Flagstaff. And so this has brought closure to them. This was the first time they'd been together since the sentencing in the courthouse. And so this is the FBI agent, Doug Lintner. This is Tom Ross, who's the evidence technician who processed the crime scene down in Supai with Tamami's body and her rental car. This is Diana, the counselor. And this is Larry Thomas. He was another detective with the Coconino County Sheriff's Office. And so they, at this party, it was kind of, they were really, there was something about this case that really hurt, your heart in so many different ways. And so being able to, have this story and kind of have a positive light at the end of the tunnel with this, brought closure for them as well.
We've got time for a couple more questions. This is Carol.
Annette, I'm usually a fiction reader, so this was sort of something a little different from what I would usually read, but I was just totally captivated. I just thought the characters were so compelling.
Mm-hmm.
And when I finished the book, I wanted to see pictures of the place. I wanted to see pictures of your time in Japan at the ancestral home. I wanted to see all, I love the beautiful picture in the book of Tamami and her dog, but I wanted to see what does her dad look like, and I wanted to see the village and the Fowles and Randy and his family, and so I'm hoping you'll tell me there's a website where I can go.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I should do that. Yeah, I think I'm definitely wanting to do kind of a expanded ebook version, with all the photos and everything in it. So, but yeah, maybe in the meantime, I will do some kind of website with I think that's a good idea. Yeah, yeah. So, because I have all that stuff,
I don't know if you're comfortable talking about this, but because your personal path took such a chunk of your life, and the history of the life of this book took such a long time, how was your son impacted by this? This must have been a huge part of his growing up as well.
It was, yeah, definitely working, not just so much the book, but I was compiling research all the time. I didn't actually write it until he was in college. I didn't feel like I could write it when he was in the house, because writing about the murder and also writing about, I felt like in writing this, I wanted to not write it from a distance, but write it in a way that the reader felt like they were experiencing it, that they were feeling what Randy felt and what Tamami felt and what I felt when I was a kid. And so to relive that was a pretty dark experience. I didn't want to do it when he left for college a year and a half ago, and the minute he was in college in his dorm, I started writing. And so I wrote it when he was not home. But the whole time I was going through the PTSD, he was there, obviously. And so I feel like he is such a compassionate, grounded kid. If he was a needier kid, or, I don't know, he just is so accommodating and so sweet, and he was just wanted to help, and he is very proud of the book. He shared it with all his friends, and it's a really positive thing for him. It means a lot to him that I went through this, and now I have a positive result, that I can point to, instead of, just kind of being lost in the pit of despair. So I think I've been blessed to have someone like him as a son, and he helped me to get through. No, I'm getting emotional. you know, I'm sure all the parents here feel this way, like when you're going through hardship, it's your children that help you get through, you know, like they're the light at the end of the tunnel. And so that was definitely like working through this, through my own hardships, was to be a better parent. And I did become a better parent for him, and it was just my love for him. In fact, can I just read something real quick?
Oh, yeah, I
Okay.
realized I
All
forgot
right,
to ask you to read.
so there's this in my acknowledgments, you know, and I thank all the people, and like my sister Elizabeth, who's here, my older sister, there's a whole chapter devoted to her. But the last thing in my acknowledgments is I say, finally, I am grateful to my son Austin. A large portion of his childhood unfolded during the decade I worked on Pure Land. Austin was with me every step of the way, hiking to Supai, staying in the Navajo Hogan in Monument Valley, and journeying across Japan. Many children would complain under such circumstances, but not Austin, not once. He was always upbeat and ready for the next adventure. If there was any single inspiration driving this book, it was the joy of being Austin's mother. Amid so much darkness, Austin has been the brightest, most heavenly light.
Well, in addition to everything else that Annette has done, she's also co-founded a Healing Hands project to help kids
Healing Lands.
Healing Lands. Healing Lands?
Yeah.
Oh, Healing Hands, lands. To help kids be out, who've had abuse, to be outside. So that's a nonprofit that she started. She's doing a benefit at Book Women tomorrow at 7. Things that we can do to help Annette would be to buy the book. We have 11 left here, and she'll sign yours if you haven't gotten it signed yet. It's available on Amazon, and it's also a Kindle book. And if you like the book, if you would write a review on Amazon, that helps out. Is there anything else we can do to support you?
No, if you can just, you know, like I mentioned before, the bigger publishers wanted to change the story, and it was so important to be more commercial, to make it easier to market. As you can see, this is a complicated book. And so, you know, I went with a smaller publisher that honored the story in the way that I wanted to tell it, and without concerns about marketing. But so the marketing is left to me. And so it's very much a grassroots, do-it-yourself kind of marketing. So the word of mouth, spreading it, sharing it among your friends, anyone who here is in a book club, I'd be happy if you just share it with your book club. If you decide you want to do it for your book club, I could Skype with you, like we could schedule a Skype session and discuss the book. I'd love to do that. Yeah, writing reviews on Amazon, whatever you can do. If you feel like you support the message of this book, I'd really appreciate your help in getting the word out. And this nonprofit I established is funding wilderness trips for child victims of domestic violence. In addition to that, a lot of bookstore events, I try and make it team up with a women's and children's shelter to fundraise for them, so that some of the profits from the book go to the shelter and also raise awareness. And so for the event tomorrow night at Book Woman, it's going to be a fundraiser for the Safe Alliance here in Austin. And so anyway, I want to try and ultimately make some domestic violence something that we can talk about as, you know, society, instead of kind of hide it under the rug or think that it's something that only happens in poor communities like Native American reservations, because I can attest it happens in upper middle class families too. And so we need to kind of embrace the notion that we need to all talk about it and support people that are experiencing it, and encourage people to know that they can acknowledge these issues and it will not destroy them. They will be better for it and healthier for it and better parents, and it will be better as a culture.
Will you all join me in thanking Annette?